Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Last time, we read the prologue to my book, The Mighty Dozen. Now we're going to get into the actual story and how everything came into place. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 1. Relationship Problems. It was a warm, sunny day in the middle of April of 1981 in the suburbs of Reno. 4 months had passed since Arthur Gammelthorpe had died, and his death had brought some of his old campers together. They had all attended the funeral in California, and since then all but James and Carly had moved on from it. James had fallen into a deep depression since Arthur was like a father figure to him, and although he was able to do his police detective work well, when at home, he was like a zombie and spent most of his time locked in his room, not speaking to anybody. Not because he was angry at anyone, but because he was too upset and felt like he couldn't share his problems with anyone. As for Carly, her depression spiraled down into anger, and James's depression and obliviousness did not help. Instead of talking about their problems calmly and rationally, James and Carly's stress from their jobs, coupled with Arthur's death, led to them coming home bad-tempered and end up fighting with each other. Sometimes it got to the point where they ended up hitting each other and locking themselves in their rooms, not speaking to each other at home. Now 4 months later, James's and Carly's relationship had taken such a bad turn that they only talked to each other at work, where they were partners, and avoided each other most of the day. They also had been ordering takeout food most nights since they were too stressed to cook for themselves lately. Recently, however, their friends from camp came to visit them from time to time for emotional support. Sometimes they'd spend a weekend with James and Carly to keep them company. Gary even sent them free food from his family's diner, which lasted them nearly 10 days. All this emotional support from their friends did helped a little, but it didn't stop them from fighting. In fact, the only time James and Carly did not fight was when Richard and Christy came to visit them. Whenever James or Carly got angry, Richard or Christy would take hold of their arms, firmly but gently, and have them take deep breaths until their anger dissipated. This always worked, but the only difference was that Richard would say, "Breathe in, breathe out," repeatedly, while Christy would say nothing at all. Another thing, while Carly was easy to control since she was smaller and skinnier than they were, Richard and Christy had to be extra cautious when James was angry. Although Richard was only a little shorter than James, and Christy was almost as strong as he was, they could not tackle James to the ground like Carly, and they had to quell his anger before he got physical. That is not to say James was abusive. He wasn't. But he couldn't always control his anger, or his strength, which could lead to him unintentionally hurting someone. But overall, though, like I said, James and Carly got along a lot better when their friends were around, especially when Richard and Christy visited. On the day our story begins, James and Carly were off from work for the weekend and were sitting alone in their rooms. Frank, Gary, and Joey were visiting them. Gary and Joey were on spring break, and Frank took a little vacation from work to visit James and Carly. His younger brothers, Glenn and Daryl, helped Donnie out at the auto shop in the meantime. Reginald and Pedro were busy that weekend and couldn't make it. As for Richard and Christy, although they were on spring break as well, they decided to spend it in Las Vegas, especially since it was during Richard's birthday. They had offered to invite James and Carly to join them, but Carly got angry because they asked James instead of both of them. The two of them argued, and James ultimately declined the invitation. In the living room, not much was going on. Frank was on the sofa reading the morning newspaper with a headline about President Ronald Reagan's recovery following his assassination attempt from a few weeks earlier. This was 1981, mind you. Gary was in the corner of the room, meditating on a mat. He regularly did yoga. And as for Joey, he was eating in the kitchen, eating a BLT contentedly. After a while, Joey broke the silence. "Do you think Richard and Christy will come and visit before they go back to UCLA?" he asked Frank. Frank snorted. "If they're smart, they'll stay away from here as long as possible," he said without looking up. "Frankie!" exclaimed Joey. "Well, can you blame me for saying that?" Frank turned to look at Joey. "Ever since Arthur died, James and Carly have been at each other's throats. It's enough to drive anyone off the wall. They're our friends, and Richard and Christy always know what to do when they're angry. I know, and they've been close to Arthur for all those summers we spent at the camp at Pyramid Lake. But they haven't really done anything in their spare time since the funeral, for goodness sake." Joey smiled. "Yeah, they always swam together, rode bikes together, ate together in the mess hall when they got older. It seemed like things would never change when they bought this house." Frank managed to smile. "They were such a happy couple. Remember how they always would have barbecues on weekends when they first moved in together?" Gary, who had just finished his exercise, got up from the floor and chimed in. "I remember bringing them my family's famous gyro and lamb to roast outside in the backyard. And when they were alone, they'd spend almost every night in their heated jacuzzi tub smoking large cigars together," Joey added. Frank, Gary, and Joey all sighed happily. "Ah, those were the days," sighed Frank. But then his expression became bitter. "Now, however, they're constantly fighting or attempting to kill each other." "Keep it down," shushed Gary. "They'll hear us. And you know how Carly has been particularly nasty lately." "She used to be such a sweetheart," said Joey. "Now you never know what's going to set her off when she's angry." "Well, never mind Carly," said Frank impatiently. "What about James?" Hearing this, Gary and Joey looked at Frank with concern, as a somber expression dawned on his face. "I'm really worried about him." "You worry all the time," said Gary. "Yes, but this is James we're talking about. Ever since Arthur's funeral, if he's not on patrol, he's either fighting with Carly, locked in his room, or sitting alone on the observatory deck in the back. He can't spend the rest of his life like this, you know." "He'll come around eventually," said Gary reassuringly. "Just be patient. You know how close James was to Arthur." "Either way," said Frank a little irritably, "it's not healthy for a person to dwell on the loss of a loved one, especially since he works as a police detective." Suddenly, there came an angry voice from the bedroom. "Frank! Where the hell did you put my comb?" "For God's sake," said Frank under his breath. "I didn't touch your stupid hair comb, Carly," he shouted. "Oh boy," said Joey, rolling his eyes. "Here we go again," said Gary. "Just stay calm." The bathroom door was flung open, and Carly stormed out of the bathroom in a magenta bathrobe, her elbow-length strawberry blonde hair in curlers, and her green eyes flashing with anger, and her hair comb in her left hand. Frank, Gary, and Joey all cringed when they saw her approach them. "I shower, shampoo my hair, put it in curlers, but then I can't find my goddamn hair comb. How many times have I told you idiots not to touch my stuff?" "We used James's bathroom," Frank snapped back at her. "You must have misplaced them yourself." "Me?" Carly exclaimed. "It's an outrage, Carly," said Gary calmly. "I know I'm not Richard or Christy, but please calm down. We're not here to fight, okay? Now, can you please put some clothes on?" At first, Carly looked like she wanted to snap at Gary, but upon hearing his words, she calmed down a little bit and silently went to her room to get dressed. Frank was stunned. "How is it you always manage not to lose your temper?" he asked. "Meditation helps a great deal," said Gary simply. "Besides, Reggie says that if you feed into a person's anger, it only makes things worse. If you stay calm, they'll be calm." That's definitely something Reggie would say," muttered Joey. "I'm going to check on James," said Frank, heading down the hallway. James had been spending all morning in his room looking at photographs of himself and his friends when they were at summer camp. When he got to a section showing photos of himself with Carly, he stopped suddenly and began to shiver. Outside, Frank cautiously raised his hand and gently knocked on the door. James? Jimmy? Buddy, are you in there? Who is it? It's Frankie. What do you want, Frankie? James sounded very deadpan. You spend most of the last day in your room, and we miss seeing your face. And it's a beautiful day out, and we want to spend it with you. Frank held his breath in apprehension. Okay, I'm coming, said James after a moment. Frank sighed in relief as he heard James get up and walk to the door. But when the door opened, Frank had to hide his surprise. James's dark brown hair was disheveled, his brown eyes were bloodshot, and all he had on were gym shorts over his underwear, revealing his muscular frame. He looked as if he hadn't slept in several days as he yawned loudly and stretched his muscular arms. Nice to see you up and about again, Jimmy, smiled Frank. Thank you, Frankie, sighed James, affectionately patting Frank on the back as he walked down the hall. Quickly, Frank took a peek in James's room, and upon seeing the photo album lying on the floor next to James's bed, Frank looked worried. In the kitchen, James took out a quart-sized container of pulp-free orange juice. While he was doing so, Frank dashed back to the living room where Gary and Joey were sitting on the sofa. Any word? Gary asked. He's up and about, said Frank. And? Joey inquired. Frank sighed. He was looking at the photo album again, he whispered. Gary and Joey looked deeply troubled, but all three of them changed their expressions once James entered the room with the orange juice in his right hand. Without a word, he sat down in a comfy armchair and took another swig. At last, Frank broke the silence. If you don't mind me asking, James, why are you drinking an excessive amount of orange juice? Out of the bottle? Dude, Gary muttered. He and Joey looked a little disgusted. Well, for one thing, replied James, it's a good alternative to alcohol to deal with my depression since Arthur died. For another thing, it's healthier than drinking Gatorade all the time when I work out. Water helps too, said Joey. I know, Joey, said James impatiently. I work out all the time and was very active in school when it comes to sports. Well, anyways, Frank quickly added to diffuse the tension, I was thinking maybe we can go to the community pool. It's a beautiful day and there's no better way to spend a day like this. Maybe meet some chicks, dude, Gary added, smirking. And we want you to join us very much, said Frank, pretending he hadn't heard what Gary had said. Please, Joey pleaded when James didn't answer right away.